Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the November webinar of the JFK Peace Speech Committee. My name is Martin Schatz, and I'm a coordinator for the committee. And I want to thank Sharon Abreu, who's doing our tech tonight and who did a lot of tech with Jim during the week in preparation. So thank you very much. We're delighted to have Jim Douglas with us this evening. And as is our custom, we'll begin by showing President Kennedy's American University commencement address. This will be followed by Jim's commentary and then a question and answer period with the audience. As usual, we'll be taking questions from the chat, so please put your questions there. Given the size of the audience this evening, I'm not sure we'll be able to get to everyone's question, but we will do our best. So without further delay, we turn to President Kennedy's speech.
President Anderson, members of the faculty, Board of Trustees, distinguished guests, my old colleague, Senator Bob Byrd, who has earned his degree through many years of attending Knight Law School, while I am earning mine in the next 30 minutes, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pride that I participate in this ceremony of the American University, sponsored by the Methodist Church, founded by Bishop John Fletcher Hurst, and first opened by President Woodrow Wilson in 1914. This is a young and growing university, but it has already fulfilled Bishop Hurst's enlightened hope for the study of history and public affairs in a city devoted to the making of history and to the conduct of the public's business. By sponsoring this institution of higher learning for all who wish to learn, whatever their color or their creed, the Methodists of this area and the nation deserve the nation's thanks. And I commend all those who are today graduating. Professor Woodrow Wilson once said that every man sent out from a university should be a man of his nation, as well as a man of his time. And I'm confident that the men and women who carry the honor of graduating from this institution will continue to give from their lives, from their talents, a high measure of public service and public support. There are few earthly things more beautiful than a university, wrote John Masefield in his tribute to English universities, and his words are equally true today. He did not refer to towers or to campuses. He admired the splendid beauty of a university because it was, he said, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, The tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counterweapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours. And even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, But let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others. The communist drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today. For there can be no doubt that if all nations could refrain from interfering in the self-determination of others, the peace would be much more assured. This will require a new effort to achieve world law, a new context for world discussions. It will require increased understanding between the Soviets and ourselves. An increased understanding will require increased contact and communication. One step in this direction is the proposed arrangement for a direct line between Moscow and Washington to avoid on each side the dangerous delays, misunderstandings, and misreadings of others' actions which might occur at a time of crisis. We have also been talking in Geneva about our first step measures of arms controls, designed to limit the intensity of the arms race and reduce the risk of accidental war. Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace, which would take the place of arms. The pursuit of disarmament has been an effort of this government since the 1920s. It has been urgently sought by the past three administrations. And however dim the prospects are today, we intend to continue this effort, to continue it in order that all countries, including our own, can better grasp what the problems and the possibilities of disarmament are. The only major area of these negotiations where the end is in sight, yet where a fresh start is badly needed, is in a treaty to outlaw nuclear tests. The conclusion of such a treaty, so near and yet so far, would check the spiraling arms race in one of its most dangerous areas. It would place the nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms. It would increase our security. It would decrease the prospects of war. Surely this goal is sufficiently important to require our steady pursuit, yielding neither to the temptation to give up the whole effort, nor the temptation to give up our insistence on vital and responsible safeguards. I'm taking this opportunity, therefore, to announce two important decisions in this regard. First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. Second, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not
Applause.
We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one. Nor would such a treaty be a substitute for disarmament, but I hope it will help us achieve it. Finally, my fellow Americans, let us examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home. The quality and spirit of our own society must justify and support our efforts abroad. We must show it in the dedication of our own lives, as many of you who are graduating today will have an opportunity to do by serving without pay in the Peace Corps abroad or in the proposed National Service Corps here at home. But wherever we are, we must all, in our daily lives, live up to the age-old faith that peace and freedom walk together. In too many of our cities today, the peace is not secure because freedom is incomplete. It is the responsibility of the executive branch at all levels of government, local, state, and national, to provide and protect that freedom for all of our citizens by all means within our authority. It is the responsibility of the legislative branch at all levels, wherever the authority is not now adequate, to make it adequate. And it is the responsibility of all citizens in all sections of this country to respect the rights of others and respect the law of the land. All this is not unrelated to world peace. When a man's way please the Lord, the scriptures tell us, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence. While we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let us also safeguard human interests. And the elimination of war and arms is clearly in the interests of both. No treaty, however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated, uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Thank you again, everyone, for being with us this evening. I'm sure most of you need no introduction to Jim Douglas, but I want to say a few words anyhow. Jim is a decades-long peace activist, a member of the Catholic worker movement. He and his wife, Shelley, have a Catholic worker house in Birmingham, Alabama, and they were also co-founders of Ground Zero for Nonviolent Action Against the Trident submarine. Jim is one of the foremost practitioners in this country of Mahatma Gandhi's principles of nonviolent revolution. Some of his experiences are presented in his book, Lightning East to West, Jesus, Gandhi, and the Nuclear Age. In the course of writing his recently released Martyrs to the Unspeakable, assassinations of JFK, Malcolm Martin, and RFK, he had to interrupt the work in order to write a book on Gandhi's assassination, Gandhi and the Unspeakable. Many of you are familiar with his work, JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters. This is a remarkable book in which Jim attempted to resurrect JFK in us, the readers, and charged us with the task of carrying out and continuing the work and struggle for which President Kennedy gave his life, world peace. Our JFK Peace Speech Committee is a direct response to Jim's book. So welcome, Jim. It's all yours.
It's all mine. There are so many wonderful people on this broadcast. I don't know how to begin, but I'll begin with you, Marty. I'm so glad to be with you today on this anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination, because you have guided me for so many years in examining that event, which so changed our history. Thank you. When JFK begins that great American University speech we just heard, and says that the peace he seeks is not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, and not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave, he is countering his own national security advisors. His generals and covert agency directors took his commitment to peace on earth so seriously that they took him from our midst. In fact, the planners of war on earth knew all about John Kennedy's vision for a more peaceful planet before he became president. They blocked him then from being able to realize it as president. The CIA had a bullseye on JFK before he moved into the White House. In January 1961, CIA Director Allen Dulles feared the incoming president would seek the release from prison of the Congo's first democratically elected president, Patrice Lumumba. Dulles and the CIA destroyed that possibility by having Lumumba killed before Kennedy could take charge of U.S. policy. Patrice Lumumba and two senior colleagues in his government, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, were executed by a firing squad on January 17, 1961, 3 days before Kennedy took office. Lumumba's murder was kept secret until its proximity to Kennedy's inauguration could recede into darkness. By collaborating with Belgian intelligence officials to retake the Congo's rich uranium minefields through the killing of Congo's president, the CIA preempted a key decision the new U.S. president could have made for African independence. The CIA's subversion of Kennedy's vision was at full tilt before he was inaugurated. When the president was finally informed of Lumumba's death, it was not from CIA Chief Dulles, but by a phone call from his UN ambassador Adlai Stevenson on February 13, 1961. White House photographer Jacques Lowe snapped a famous photo of the president's pain on hearing of Lumumba's death. Author David Talbot has described the picture as one of the most searing documents of the Kennedy presidency. In the close-up shot, JFK looks physically stricken as he absorbs the news on the phone, with his eyes squeezed shut and his right hand clasped to his face. The picture contained all of the sorrows that were to come. Photographer Jacques Lowe said, his hand went to his head in utter despair. "Oh no," I heard him groan. In the spring of 1961, Attorney General Robert Kennedy conducted a revealing investigation into the thwarted Bay of Pigs invasion, in which Premier Fidel Castro's forces swamped and defeated a CIA-trained Cuban exiles brigade. RFK discovered how the CIA's and the Pentagon's planners overrode the president's orders, lied, and plotted against him. They had tried to manipulate JFK into ordering the Air Force and Marines into a total U.S. invasion of Cuba. He resisted them. The Bay of Pigs showed JFK, with the help of RFK, the folly of allowing his top spies and generals to challenge him into their Cold War plots. The Bay of Pigs was the first stage of the president's enlightenment through the courage of confronting his national security hierarchy. 3 years after his death, a New York Times feature article on the CIA cited this statement by JFK without further comment. They said that President Kennedy, as the enormity of the Bay of Pigs disaster came home to him, said to one of his officials in his administration, "I want to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds." On October 24th, 1963, JFK granted an Oval Office interview to a French reporter, Jean Daniel, who he knew was on his way to Cuba to interview Fidel Castro. Daniel, he hoped, would, by his back-to-back interviews of Kennedy and Castro, become his impromptu messenger to his adversary. Daniel, in turn, realized in his 25-minute session alone with Kennedy what the president's underlying reason was for seeing him. JFK knew Daniel provided a unique opportunity for him to do, through presidentially guided interviews, the politically forbidden act, talking to the enemy whom the U.S. corporate, military, and intelligence complex wanted to crush. But Kennedy, like Khrushchev, wanted to talk rather than to fight. Thus, the reporter became the president's unofficial envoy to the premier on a risky mission in the fall of 1963. It was part of JFK's ultimate initiative for peace, a bold strategy that was moving forward in Cuba, even as assassins closed in on the president in Dallas, thus preventing the completion of the Kennedy-Khrushchev-Castro turn toward peace. Daniel almost failed to see Castro. During the journalist's 3 weeks in Cuba interviewing people in every walk of life, Castro remained inaccessible to him, a leader deluged by work, especially from a recent hurricane's impact on the country. Finally, on the night before Daniel's scheduled departure from Havana, when he had lost hope of seeing Castro, as the journalist later wrote, "Fidel came to my hotel. He had heard of my interview with the president. He went up to my room at 10 in the evening and did not leave until 4 in the following morning, on November 20th, 1963. For 6 straight hours, 2 days before Dallas, Fidel Castro struggled to understand the dialogical challenge of his enemy, John F. Kennedy. To the fascinated revolutionary, Daniel conveyed his adversary's transcribed words, chosen especially for Castro. In the October 24th White House interview, Daniel said, "John Kennedy mustered all his persuasive force. JFK said to Fidel, through Daniel, 'I believe that there is no country in the world including all the African regions, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. I believe that we created, built, and manufactured the Castro movement out of whole cloth and without realizing. I believe that the accumulation of these mistakes has jeopardized all of Latin America. I approved of the proclamation which Fidel Castro made in the Sierra Maestra when he justifiably called for justice and especially yearned to rid Cuba of corruption. I will go even further. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Batista regime, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. That is perfectly clear. When Daniel was recounting Kennedy's support of the revolution to Castro, he said, Fidel listened with devouring and passionate interest. He pulled at his beard. He yanked his parachutist beret down over his eyes. He adjusted his Maquis tunic, all the while making me the target of 1,000 malicious sparks cast by his deep-sunk, lively eyes. Then Daniel relayed to Castro Kennedy's final, fiercely challenging words. I know that Castro betrayed the promises made in the Sierra Maestra, and that he has agreed to be a Soviet agent in Latin America. I know that through his fault, either his will to independence, his madness, or communism, the world was on the verge of nuclear war in October 1962. I must say, I don't know whether he realizes this, or even if he cares about it. JFK smiled, then he said, you can tell me whether he does when you come back. 3 times Castro had Daniel repeat certain remarks, particularly those in which Kennedy expressed his criticism of the Batista regime. And lastly, those in which Kennedy accused Fidel of having almost caused a war fatal to all humanity. When Daniel finally stopped talking, he expected an explosion. Instead, I was treated to a lengthy silence, and at the end of that silence to a calm, composed, often humorous, always thoughtful exposition. Castro was determined to come to terms with his opponent, who he believed would soon hear his response. In a further transmission by Daniel to Kennedy and to his brother here as well, on his return to the White House. The Cuban premier then said, I believe Kennedy is sincere. I also believe that today the expression of this sincerity could have political significance. I'll explain what I mean. I haven't forgotten that Kennedy centered his electoral campaign against Nixon on the theme of firmness toward Cuba. I have not forgotten the Machiavellian tactics and the equivocation, the attempts at invasion, the pressures, the blackmail, the organization of a counter-revolution, the blockade, and above everything, all the retaliatory measures which are imposed long before there was the pretext and alibi of communism. But I feel that Kennedy inherited a difficult situation. I don't think a president of the United States is ever really free. And I believe Kennedy is at present feeling the impact of this lack of freedom. I also believe he now understands the extent to which he has been misled, especially, for example, on Cuban reaction at the time of the attempted Bay of Pigs invasion. I also think he is a realist. He is now registering that it is impossible to simply wave a wand and cause us and the explosive situation through Latin America to disappear. After his 6-hour session with Castro, Daniel postponed his departure from Cuba. He accepted the Cuban premier's invitation to have lunch with him 2 days later at his summer residence on Veradero Beach. It was there, while the two men were talking at 1:30 p.m. Cuban time on November 22nd, 1963, that the phone rang. A secretary in guerrilla garb said it was an urgent call for the prime minister from Osvaldo Dorticos, president of Cuba. Fidel picked up the phone. Daniel heard him say, "Como? Un atentado? What's that? An attempted assassination?" Castro turned to Daniel. He said Kennedy had just been struck down in Dallas. With the receiver back to his ear, he said, "Herido muy gravemente, wounded very seriously." When he hung up the phone, he repeated 3 times, una mala noticia. This is bad news. He remained silent, waiting for another call with more news. As he began to speculate who might have targeted Kennedy, a second call came in. The hope was that the president was still alive and could be saved. Castro said with evident satisfaction, "If they can, he is already reelected." Just before 2 p.m., Castro and Daniel waited by a radio for more news. Rene Vallejo, a Castro liaison for the Kennedy negotiations, stood by. He translated the NBC reports coming in from Miami. Finally, the words came through. President Kennedy was dead. Castro stood up, looked at Daniel, and said, "Everything is changed. Everything is going to change." Robert Kennedy soon knew the details of Fidel Castro's receptive response to JFK's invitation to dialogue. Jean Daniel made it public. His description of the breakthrough exchange between the two leaders, one now gone, appeared in successive issues of the New Republic magazine the month after the assassination. RFK saw the president's outreach to his government's greatest hemisphere enemy cut down by the guns of Dallas. Why did no one speak of it? Was connecting the two events truly unspeakable? Was JFK's decision to talk secretly with his Havana adversary just too obvious a motive for an in-house murder? The secret diplomacy between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev began at 6 p.m. on May 9, 1961, when U.S. reporter Frank Holman and Russian secret agent Georgy Bolshakov approached the granite steps leading up to a side entrance to the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. Georgy Bolshakov, when telling the story decades later, recalled his focus on the man standing back from the top of the steps. He said, "Robert Kennedy, in his shirt sleeves, with a jacket slung over his shoulders, stood at the doorway talking with 2 of his men. I went up to Robert Kennedy. He ran down the steps briskly, and he held out a hand to me." The U.S. Attorney General led the Soviet intelligence officer across Constitution Avenue to the mall. When they walked across the mall, Kennedy tried to put Bolshakov at ease by asking him about the USSR magazine he edited. Bolshakov talked on nervously about his editorial duties. At RFK's suggestion, they sat down on the lawn. RFK continued speaking to Bolshakov. The president, he said, believes that strained relations between our two countries come chiefly from misunderstanding and misinterpretations of one another's intentions and actions. The president has taken over from General Eisenhower, who was a big military leader. He has inherited such men in key posts as the CIA director Allen Dulles, General Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and others. My brother's mistake, he said to the Russian agent, my brother's mistake is he hasn't removed them right away. These men make outdated recommendations and suggestions which are out of keeping with the president's new course. My brother has been compelled to go by their mistaken judgments in decision-making. Cuba has changed all our foreign policy concepts. For us, the events in the Bay of Pigs are not a flop, but the best lesson we have ever learned. So we are no longer going to repeat our past mistakes. The Kennedys were determined to go on upholding fundamental U.S. interests, even by force of arms. However, as Bolshakov then reported to Khrushchev, he said to Khrushchev, John Kennedy did not want these actions to be taken as a challenge to the Soviet side. The president, his brother had emphasized, wanted to work with, not against, his Cold War opponent in order to resolve their mutual conflicts without war. For that very reason, this is Bolshakov telling Khrushchev, Robert Kennedy feared for the life of the president, besieged by those in his own government who demanded a more militant stand against the Soviets. The Attorney General had said bluntly to Bolshakov, they can put him away any moment. Therefore, he must tread carefully in certain matters and never push his way through, unquote. This was the first explicit warning Kennedy would give Bolshakov that the president's life was endangered by his determination to dialogue with his Cold War enemies. Robert Kennedy and Georgy Bolshakov talked for an intense 4 hours in their conversation. Our conversation ended, Bolshakov said, well before 10 p.m. Well after 10 p.m. Robert gave me a lift home. I had a sleepless night. In the morning, my report of the talk went straight to Moscow. Thus began the secret transmissions between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, facilitated by Robert Kennedy, as told by their channel, Georgy Bolshakov, in his article, The Hotline, which was serialized in 3 issues of a Moscow magazine a quarter of a century later, which I read. Bolshakov was describing a chapter unique in Cold War diplomacy. President Kennedy, through his brother, the Attorney General, was telling a Russian agent representing Soviet Chairman Khrushchev that JFK couldn't trust his own military and CIA leadership. As early as May 9, 1961, the date of the first RFK-Bolshakov meeting, and 3 weeks after the Bay of Pigs, JFK realized he was already in a deep fix from Allen Dulles' CIA and General Lemnitzer's Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yet he knew his decisions to fire Allen Dulles for the Bay of Pigs and later to replace General Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would not free him from the relentless pressures to wage a war that would be, as he called it, the final failure, unquote, a war he absolutely had to avert as president. Moreover, that threat of a war of human extinction circled the earth. To deal with his greatest challenge, Kennedy had to seek common ground with his foreign adversary, Khrushchev. Capitalist Kennedy was reaching across the no man's land of the Cold War to communist Khrushchev for the sake of world peace. By exchanging secret messages with Khrushchev, to reduce the risk of war, JFK was putting himself at increasing risk. U.S. government agents were tracking and monitoring GRU agent Georgy Bolshakov everywhere he went, as they had for years. What then did J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles think on learning that RFK, on behalf of JFK, was meeting with Khrushchev's personal agent? That was not the main concern of JFK, who as president was resolved to do all he could to avoid the destruction of the human race by war. On the morning of August 31, 1962, 6 weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis, as Georgy Bolshakov was preparing for his flight the next day on his way to Moscow for vacation, he received a call from Robert Kennedy. "Georgie," Robert said, "since you're leaving tomorrow, I want to say goodbye to you in person. Can you meet me tonight?" When Bolshakov arrived at the Attorney General's office, Kennedy said to his surprise, "The president is waiting for you. He'd like you to deliver a message to Khrushchev." When they met with the president in the Oval Office, JFK shook hands with the Russian. He motioned him to a chair. Unknown to his visitor, for over a month, the president had been preoccupied with increasing intelligence reports of a Soviet military buildup in Cuba. Robert especially feared it might include nuclear missile sites. He was right. In that context, the president said, "Look, Georgie, I know you're off to Moscow for a vacation. That's good. I'd like to do me a favor and say to Premier Khrushchev the following. Llewellyn Thompson, our Moscow ambassador, informs me Khrushchev is concerned about our planes flying low over Soviet-bound ships. Tell him I've ordered these flyovers stopped today." He gazed out the window in silence. Then he said, "I believe the outlook for American-Soviet relations is good. I am profoundly convinced of that. To my mind, the signing of a treaty banning nuclear tests will be the next milestone along the road to their improvement. Tell Khrushchev I hope to see him again in the near future," he said with a smile. After the meeting with President Kennedy, Bolshakov stepped outside with Robert Kennedy into the dusk. They walked slowly down a driveway lined with tall trees. Somehow, as Bolshakov would write later in that article, "I felt so worried I could hardly breathe." Robert, who'd been silent in the meeting with the president, said suddenly, "God damn it, Georgie, doesn't Premier Khrushchev realize the president's position? Doesn't the premier know that the president has enemies as well as friends? Believe me, my brother really means what he says about American-Soviet relations. But every step he takes to meet Premier Khrushchev halfway costs my brother a lot of effort. If the premier, if he just took the trouble to be, for a moment at least, in the president's shoes, he would understand him. In a gust of blind hate, his enemies may go to any length, including killing him." Bolshakov was stunned. Shortly before his own death, in 1989, he reflected on Robert Kennedy's outpouring. He said, "I had never seen Robert so open and frank before. I had the impression he told me what the president had left unstated." JFK had in fact made a more restrained but similar statement himself to Mikhail Kharlamov, Khrushchev's spokesperson, in a meeting the president had with Kharlamov and Alexei Ajubay, Khrushchev's son-in-law at the White House on June the 26th, 1961. Karlamov later recalled, "We were talking about U.S.-Soviet relations, and I said to him, Mr. President, we must advance relations between our two countries. You seem to be in favor of that. Why are you not moving faster?" And Kennedy answered, "You don't understand this country. If I move too fast on U.S.-Soviet relation, I'll either be thrown into an insane asylum or be killed." In the midst of the worst crisis in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK through RFK asked for help from their enemy, and Nikita gave it. He gave it. Instead of a war of human extinction, the Kennedys and Khrushchev chose together to turn toward peace. They suffered for it. In spite of their continuing conflicts, the Kennedys and Khrushchev deliberately chose to trust finally the enemy. As a result, neither side won the biggest battle of the Cold War. Humanity survived. The Kennedys and Khrushchev did not. For both Cold War blocs, serious peacemaking was considered treason. The dominant U.S. view of the missile crisis is that we won because Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union backed down and withdrew their missiles from Cuba. President Kennedy took a different view. As Robert Kennedy reported in 13 days, the president respected Khrushchev for properly determining what was in his own country's interest and what was in the interest of mankind. If it was a triumph, it was a triumph for the next generation and for any particular, not for any particular government or people. Humanity in particular, the next generation, which was Kennedy's great concern, won in the end. But would the members of the next generation and those that follow it have the same wisdom? The same wisdom as the Kennedys and Khrushchev, to turn from the darkness of our military madness toward another end. What end would they and we pursue? RFK knew that if he ran for president in 1968 to regain his power, his brother had to stop the Vietnam War and the power to end the nuclear arms race. The same systemic forces that had killed JFK stood between him and the nuclear arms race. The same systemic forces stood between him. His decision to run for the position where he could do the most good would be a trigger in the minds of JFK's assassins, lest he revive as president the Cold War ending vision of his brother. His moral challenge was to seek an end whose means, widening his support among a people's movement for peace through justice, would heighten the likelihood of his murder to a virtual certainty. Robert Kennedy, whose post-Dallas mind united prophetic biblical hope with Greek tragedy, was walking toward their fusion in the Ambassador Hotel. We can see the hope of life in our valley of death through the testimony of our prophets. Because they asked why, kept turning, and were willing to die. JFK and RFK had to go. That is our story now. We are on the same bloodiest, glorious path of humanity they blazed for our long night's journey into light. May we learn on that way to bow to the light in every human personality on earth until we see it in communion with the lives of all creatures. That's the end of the story, but it can be the beginning of ours.
Thank you, Jim. I want to mention to everyone who registered this evening, you'll be receiving a recording of a YouTube recording of this event in a follow-up email letter. And also in that letter will be an announcement of our next speaker, a friend and associate of Jim's, Kathy Kelly. I actually will also put the registration link for that session in our chat in a little bit. We're going to turn to question and answers now. I just want to also mention that the committee is hoping to create a workshop for high school and college students centered on JFK's speech. So if any of the members of the audience are educators, would be interested in helping and have some skill in this area, you can either put your information in the chat or respond to the email you'll be receiving. We're interested in any ideas people have about how to make this speech more widely known throughout the American public. So let me turn, I don't know what to say, Jim, but there's not a lot of questions in the Q&A. You may have just laid it out with such precision. But there is a question here from Weldon Nisley. He said, "Thanks so much, Jim. I'm grateful that you began with the Lumumba and Castro incidents because I was struck by how key they are to the martyrs, to the unspeakable, and JFK's presidency and transformation. What led you, that's right. What led you to that defining connection?"
It was a man who wrote a memoir about his work as an assistant to Dag Hammarskjöld in the United Nations. His name is Diane, as I recall. And he pointed out exactly how the CIA had proceeded. I mean, this isn't a mystery. It's been out there for a long time. In fact, there's nothing that's a mystery here, as Marty Schatz and Vince Salandria long ago said. There's no mystery about any of this stuff. And any investigative journalist could have written all of this long time ago, all in the ways that I have. But Diane pointed out that there was no coincidence between the fact that 3 days before Kennedy became president, that Patrice Lumumba was assassinated by forces under the control of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Belgian intelligence as well. That's just out there. And it's been out there a long time. And principally through very key sources like this man who is assistant to the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Okay. Another question is, do you see any parallels to the contemporary circumstances with NATO, EU, and Russia relationships, as well as current president and military industrial complex? And just before you answer that, I know, Michael, you have your hand up. Is it possible to put your question in the chat for us? Go ahead, Jim. Do you want to take on that question about?
I wouldn't say it's a similarity. I'd say it's almost an identity identical situation. Here is Russia, not with an adversary 90 miles away, but surrounded by bases of the United States. To put it in their put our situation like their situation. Their situation is actually much more desperate in that there are a whole series of bases around, not just one 90 miles away. And for us not to see that is just becoming an amnesia nation. We don't have any sense of our own history, and of what President Kennedy was responding to then is what Vladimir Putin is responding to from the standpoint of Russia, and in his case, in invading or responding to these bases, however you want to look at it. From his standpoint, it's a process. It's a situation of, as Kennedy looked at it from his standpoint, resisting an incursion into his sphere of influence. Kennedy didn't like it, and the United States government didn't like it when it was 90 miles away. When it's actually on your border, it's a little bit more desperate.
Okay. Yes, and at the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was also the agreement. Khrushchev trusted Kennedy to withdraw the missiles from Turkey, even though that wasn't made public. So there was definitely a quid pro quo there. Jeffrey Steele says, I remember your discussion of Thomas Merton in the JFK book. I haven't read the new book yet, but do you believe Merton was killed by the same forces?
I don't know. I have read the books concerning Merton's death, and I've spent a lot of time investigating it myself. I don't say what I don't know, but I've read the documents, and the most important document is from a Catholic sister who was a medical investigator and who was one of the first 2 or 3 people to come to Merton's body. And she described in exact terms what she saw. I think the evidence there is that he died by electric shock, by electrocution. That doesn't mean to say, and this is where I diverge strongly from the other people who investigate this and who claim that he was absolutely assassinated by something that hit his head or something of that sort. It could have been him falling back on his head. But this document, I think, is the primary document to investigate into the investigation of Thomas Merton's death. I don't know, but if he did die by the CIA's hands, I think it would have been by that shock. In other words, I think it's misleading everybody to say that the shock itself from the electric fan, which I think was a very definite impact on him, that could not have caused his assassination. And that itself could have come from the Central Intelligence Agency.
Okay. Another question. Has Jim addressed the non-governmental adversaries of Kennedy allied with CIA high-ranking military officials through retirees like far-right Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intel chief, and the rich far-right of the time, as Peter Dale Scott has written some on?
I think there were all kinds of people that were involved to some degree in the Kennedy assassination. And Willoughby would be one perhaps. But I think that if one gets too much involved in that process, one neglects the primary evidence in the case, which all of which goes to implicate the Central Intelligence Agency. I don't like to get too far away from the CIA because I don't think they got very far away from assassinating President Kennedy. And that's the evidence that is presented in JFK and the Unspeakable. JFK and the Unspeakable is the first half of the story that's in Martyrs to the Unspeakable, the current book. So the evidence is overwhelming that the CIA is the agency that is primarily involved in Kennedy's assassination. That does not, I do not mean to say that the other agencies of the United States government weren't. They're all heavily involved. But when you start talking about Willoughby, you start getting a little bit farther away from the primary instigators.
Okay. Another question. In the peace speech, when JFK said the world knows the United States will never start a war, he was under pressure to start a war. How do you understand him saying that? Who was he speaking to?
Well, I think he was speaking a little bit away from the reality. The United States will never start a war. He also said that at one point in his speech that the United States had never been at war with Russia. That's not true. We had United States forces in Russia at an early point before the revolution. You know, President Kennedy, as president of the United States, does not always speak everything he's thinking, and there are things in his American University address, like the United States will never start a war. Certainly from them until now, when did the United States not start a war? And even before then, we had been involved in such things through the Central Intelligence Agency and instigating various wars. So I don't know. Since that time, the United States has constantly been starting wars.
Okay. There's a question here. If presidents and national top leaders cannot usher peace and international cooperation, I wonder what can and will.
They can. They can, but they have to be led by their people.
Right.
President Kennedy could only do, as he said to the Quakers who visited him in his White House and whom he invited in to speak with him, he tried to emphasize to them that he couldn't go very much farther than he was trying to go with Khrushchev, unless the peace movement was out ahead of him, and out ahead of him in large numbers. Now there were 1,000 Quakers or so and massed around the White House that time, but he wanted a lot more than that. And I think he was pleading with the Quakers and pleading with all of us today to get out ahead of the presidents, whoever they may be. And I don't believe anybody should be president of the United States today because we have engaged in so much warfare and have become not simply, as Dr. King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Our government has become the greatest purveyor of terrorism in the world today. There should be no president of such an institution. But if there is one, we should be so far out ahead of that person, like the mayor of New York, for example, that the person would invite us into the White House and try to listen to all of us. So we need to be as far out ahead as the man that just got invited into the White House.
Okay. Question here from Alice Slater. aren't we doing the same thing in demonizing Russia and China with no discussion of their pleas to negotiate treaties to ban space weapons and war in space?
Yes, of course. We are demonizing Russia and China. And when we start talking about war in space, I would recommend that everyone be subscribers to Bruce Gagnon's Space Alert, which keeps us up to date on all of that in ways that I've seen in no other publication. So, but I agree totally with the perspective of the questioner.
Okay. Here's something, a comment from Gyoe Kato, a fascinating speech by JFK and talk by Jim Douglas. I would be great to have the speech and talk translated into other languages such as Japanese. This story should be told to a worldwide audience beyond English speakers and be made publicly available. Thank you.
I bow to
Yeah, that would
Sure.
be great. And, at the time the speech was given, Khrushchev, if I'm not mistaken, Khrushchev had it reprinted throughout the Soviet Union. And the Soviet citizens knew about the speech, but our citizens didn't know about the speech.
No. And thank you for that suggestion. It is a great one.
We will try and follow up on that. If you want to put your email or some contact information in the chat, we can be in touch about that. So let's just see the questions. Okay. So Ray McGovern said, would like to pick up on Ukraine if time permits. Do you want to pick up something, Ray, on that? Do you want to speak on that? Do you want to?
Yes, if I may just follow up, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Ray.
Thanks for your presentation and for your books. I just wanted
Thanks
to
for
follow
reading
up.
them.
Just wanted to follow up on the analogy between Cuba in 1962 and Ukraine in 2022. Now, I never knew that I was part of the Realism School of International Relations because I don't think it was invented way back when, but I find out that that's what I was doing for my whole career. And when John Mearsheimer warned 11 years ago that if we kept trying to get Ukraine in NATO, we would end up destroying Ukraine, I took notice. Then I watched as things developed, and I just would like to refresh people's memories who perhaps not have as followed this as closely as I. Obama in 2015 said something sensible. He said, look, there are certain things that are existential threats, okay? Now, whatever happens in Ukraine is not an existential threat to the United States. As a matter of fact, we have no core interests in Ukraine. The Russians, on the other hand, do. So, our policy should be this. The worst thing that we could do for the Ukrainian people would be to give them the idea that they could prevail over a much stronger Russia on their borders. That's the worst thing we could do. Now, there was a deputy secretary of state at the time, and he said, yes, Mr. President, you are so right. For every weapon we could give to Ukraine, the Russians could match it, and they could double it, and then they could triple it, and then they could quadruple it, end quote. Who was that deputy secretary of state? Anybody know? His name was Antony Blinken. So Biden comes in, and Biden thinks we're still master of the whole world, and Blinken changes his whole outlook. let's give lots of weapons. Let's see if we can use Ukraine to weaken Russia. Now, the business about Ukraine joining NATO is not in dispute. The Secretary General of NATO, as most of you know, Jens Stoltenberg, said 2 years ago, the Russians came to us and they said, if you keep trying to get Ukraine in NATO, we will have to invade Ukraine. And we said, no. And so he invaded Ukraine. That's the kind of leadership we have at the top of NATO. By that time, 500,000 Ukrainian youth and tens of thousands of Russians had perished in that war, unnecessary war. So, core interests, they're really important. President Trump, whatever else you can say about him, has said, you know, I recognize core interests on the part of Mr. Putin. And Mr. Putin has been acting very much, if you will forgive me for saying this, in the mold of John F. Kennedy. Perspicacious, cautious, very slow to anger, knows when he's ahead and is not going to be provoked. Luckily, it looks like President Trump has learned that lesson. The latest developments give me hope that the Ukrainian fracas will be ended not tomorrow or not next week, but maybe even by the end of the year if the proper negotiation should take place. That my point is that just finishing up with John Mearsheimer, I had asked him at an open meeting before hundreds of others, John, when you look at what was going on with the shelling of Russian speakers in the Donbass, when you look at the other threats that were coming in from missiles in Europe, do you think that Putin had any choice as to whether to invade Ukraine or not? And Mearsheimer, without batting an ash, said, "No, I don't think. I know that Putin did everything he possibly could to enforce the Minsk agreements, which was supposed to be guaranteed by Angela Merkel of Germany and Francois Hollande of France, who both laughed derisively, saying it was just a trick to give time to get the Ukrainians up to snuff militarily." So all I'm saying here is that you can make value judgments. You can say, as many have said to me, Ray McGovern, are you justifying the invasion of Ukraine? Well, no, that's not realpolitik. That's not the realistic school of IR, okay? I'm just saying this is what happens when you threaten a country on your. And the last thing, from the sublime to the ridiculous, Jim, tell the world here how close you live to the train tracks. We hear those trains coming by. It sounds like they're right out there, right out your window. Is that true, Jim? Jim?
They are right outside our window.
So you live in a very posh place on all your royalties from your books. Is that correct?
We live in the place we came to in order to stop trains carrying nuclear weapons through Birmingham, Alabama, and that's where we still live.
Thanks.
We only have a minute left, and I just wanted to share actually one thought. People have asked about, what is possible, and one of the things that I said in my book on the Kennedy assassination was that JFK was a de Klerk without an ANC. That is, de Klerk was able to get rid of apartheid because there was a whole movement to get rid of apartheid, and it was going to be gotten rid of one way or the other. And so in my view, in order to have a president who can succeed pursuing the kind of policies that Kennedy was pursuing, we need a public. I think that's what you're saying, Jim. We need a public that's pursuing those policies and is going to insist that those policies be pursued one way or the other.
We need to be going far enough out so that we might have to suffer the same consequences that President Kennedy did. We have to be peacemakers who, as Daniel Berrigan once said, need to look good on wood.
Mhm.
We're not going to be peacemakers like that. All of us, we're not going to have peace.
Okay. Well, I want to again thank everyone for joining us tonight and thank Jim for that presentation. And I recommend everyone get a copy of his new book, Martyrs to the Unspeakable, as well as, of course, JFK and the Unspeakable, which to me is an amazing. It wasn't just a writing. It wasn't just an act of writing. It was actually a political action that he carried out with this book, which is can't thank you enough for that.
Can't thank you enough for inspiring me to do it, Marty Schatz.
Okay,
Hey, Marty, Marty, you wrote your own book. Why don't you mention your own book?
I just did. I did.
Oh, you did already. Okay, sorry.
So, good night, everyone, and we will be in touch through email. Okay? Take care.